So I just quickly want to go over what your magazine composition studies should look like for your abstraction project. And what you're going to do is take your viewfinder you made in the previous assignment post. Remember, the whole of the viewfinder has to be 3 by 4 inches for this to work out correctly. And then what you're going to do next is take magazines. You could use old books, maybe junk mail, and you're going to find at least 24 interesting compositions that are non-representational, that you're not trying to frame something nice and neatly like a perfect little face or head. You're trying to just create an interesting composition within the frame. So I want to show you a few examples of those, but I also want to talk about the idea of creating a focal point, because this is kind of a key part of what you're going to look for in those compositions. And we already looked at this in the project PowerPoint. I'll just kind of quickly go over it again. There's a variety of ways that you can create a focal point, some of which we talked about in the PowerPoint. This is just sort of a brief visual guide to that again. A lot of things have to do with difference. So, for example, having a large among small objects, or a small among large, or a dark among light, or a light among dark, so something that kind of makes it stick out. Like we talked about before, an object near the center, but you do want to avoid that bullseye look that we were talking about in the project PowerPoint. Directional forces, so following that line one direction or another can help lead you to somewhere. If you have an object that is detailed, more detailed than others, that can also create a focal point. If there's one recognizable object amongst things that are unrecognizable, this happens actually a lot in this project, because sometimes it'll just look like weird wavy lines, and then suddenly you'll notice there's a finger or something else. You could think about having everything look non-representational and having one representational object become the focal point. Curve versus straight, you could think about this as even organic versus geometric. Tension at the edges, having things proximity, so if two things are grouped together more closely, that becomes a focal point. Converging lines, that's one of the things we talked about in the PowerPoint. Organic among geometric, having something irregular amongst regular, that's another one we looked at in the PowerPoint. Directional contrast, we'll actually use this more in the next project. Or texture among contrast. So you want something to stand out as kind of different. Just to show you a few examples of some previous student work. Now when you go to take a picture, don't send 24 individual images of each of those pictures, because it's going to just take up too much room. Group as many as you can into one shot. This obviously isn't 24 in one shot. This student chose to do 12 and 12. That's really the easiest way to take a picture of them. But this is a good example of a variety of compositions. Just kind of go into this to show you a few examples. So, as you're looking at each one of these, and you're going to have to pick which ones are your best, you have to think, what can I find a specific focal point? What might that be? You're going to convert these completely into line drawings. And some have some more distinct focal points than others. And when you're drawing, you can also decide to create something that has a focal point or another. Good example of that, here's a very sort of non-representational piece that has a lot of lines. This is one of those where you can kind of see those directional lines all leading us sort of to one specific area that could become a focal point. Oops, zoom out. This is another example where the lines are all kind of leading us to one specific focal point. This one has a strong focal point over towards the edge. That's really what you're trying to think about. And some of these, some are more distinct than others in this example. Let's look at some other student work here as well. Another example. As I mentioned before, you could have some pieces where there's identifiable objects like the lips sort of clearly stand out as a focal point in this piece. You could use line and line variation to make that stand out more and have some of those other lines lead you around to it. There are figures that are visible in these, but depending on how you simplify the line, some of them could become non-representational. Here's another example. It's interesting to me because these are all different student works. You can definitely see students' own aesthetic come through. So that's something to think about, as you're looking at things. Everybody has their own unique eye. There's a few good examples here too where you can see some very distinct focal points leading your eye around. If I follow the lines through the piece, what stands out the most? Here's an example where you can very clearly see that symbol in the middle. Now that might be an example of a composition to avoid because our focal point is smack in the center and it's hard to get your eyes to move back around to the edges of the piece. If the artist had actually moved, when they were creating their thumbnail, had maybe moved that away from the middle, that could be a very interesting focal point, but because it's smack in the middle, it becomes a bullseye that's hard to move away from. Let's see. Show you a couple more here. So you guys kind of get the general gist. These will become line drawings, but right now you're just exploring all those possibilities. All